Euh, Bien, nous allons commencer. Je me présente, je suis Jean-Paul Jennequin. Je suis un traducteur et également journaliste, historien de la bande dessinée. Et je vais présenter cette rencontre avec Don Rosa, dont j'ai été le traducteur et dont je traduis également les introductions pour l'intégrale qui vient de se terminer aux éditions Glénat. Et avant de commencer cet entretien avec Don, je vais passer la parole à Morgann Gicquel qui va se présenter et qui va vous expliquer pourquoi il intervient.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Morgann, je suis réalisateur. Je suis aussi fan de Don Rosa et c'est pour ça que je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui. Comme vous tous dans la salle, je pense qu'on partage tous une admiration pour l'auteur qui est à mes côtés. Et en tant que réalisateur, effectivement, j'ai eu envie de faire quelque chose, non seulement à propos de Don Rosa, mais à propos de tous les fans. Parce qu'à travers le monde, il y a pas mal de gens, notamment en Finlande, qui ont fait des albums de musique, qui ont fait des bouquins, qui ont fait des sculptures sur la jeunesse de Picsou et sur Don Rosa. Et il m'a semblé important d'en parler. Du coup, on va vous présenter en avant-première la bande-annonce d'un documentaire qui sortira l'année prochaine sur Don Rosa. La raison pour laquelle on le présente à Angoulême, c'est que c'est une production française qui est aussi coproduite au Danemark et aux États-Unis. Mais c'est aussi le moyen de lancer un site internet, le mystèrepixou.fr, sur lequel vous pourrez vous inscrire. Et nous, ça nous permet de vous envoyer des nouvelles au fur et à mesure que le tournage commencera. Donc voilà, sans plus attendre, je vais vous présenter la bande-annonce.
Don't you ever think about the children when you do those comics?
No, I'm not doing them for children. I don't object if children read them, but I'm doing them for adult fans. I've never forgotten how precious it is to have the dream job of your youth, your fondest dream, actually come true. When I first started doing it, I remember thinking, like in some imaginary situation, if I was at a big banquet reception and some big shot we were sipping martinis or something, and I'm the personal physician of the Queen of England. And I'd say, that's nothing. I write and draw Uncle Scrooge comics. These are the world's best-selling, most popular comic books, and they have been for 60, 70 years. And yet in America, they disappeared 40 years ago, and now they're totally unknown. So it's not like they're not as popular, they're unknown. I like the times when they buy a print and they want to make sure that I know it's for their 2-week-old child. In other words, they're buying it for somebody who has no idea who I am and will probably never know who I am, but
doesn't the true fans make it worth it?
Oh, that's the only reason I did it for an extra 20 years. As frustrating as that work was, the fans in Europe and the few in America, they made it all worth it.
Der er ikke nogen tegning. Nej, så skal du nå igennem 2 gange. Det er simpelthen ikke noget, tror jeg. Det er så meget, men du vil ikke få større chance. Tegninger, det får man, når man har været igennem en gang og komme hen til mig og få et nyt nummer, men vi er ude, jeg giver 400 et eller andet nummer ud. Nu har du.
I was the first person, especially in Europe, who fans could speak to. Karl Marx never traveled, so I was the first person that they could pour out their appreciation, not just for my stories, but for Marx's stories and everybody's stories. And not only did I enjoy that gratitude, but it actually, it sounds corny, it was like a duty, like a sacred duty. It was like my job to accept that appreciation and try to take it as humbly as I could. Gosh, that made it worthwhile, and it still does.
Donc, nous avons besoin de vous tous parce que les fans, c'est vous. On a besoin d'interviewer des gens, surtout des gens qui ont fait des choses, donc n'hésitez surtout pas à vous inscrire sur le site internet. Et ce qui est intéressant avec ce documentaire, c'est aussi de parler de ce qu'on appelle l'âge du fan, où aujourd'hui, n'importe qui, entre guillemets, peut poster sur YouTube des vidéos de ce dont il est fan et être employé. On a eu l'exemple avec la série britannique Doctor Who, et aussi le Tintin de Spielberg, qui ont employé des jeunes qui avaient fait des choses sur Internet. Et on veut présenter Don Rosa comme un espèce de pionnier, comme un fan qui effectivement, lui, a réussi avant tout le monde à faire ce dont il voulait une profession. Maintenant, je vais laisser la parole à l'auteur et à Jean-Paul Jennequin pour cette conférence. Je vous remercie.
Donc, Don, je vous avais déjà interviewé il y a 3 ans. Et en fait, à l'occasion du festival d'Angoulême. Et je me suis dit, on ne va pas recommencer à lui poser toujours les mêmes questions, auxquelles il répond toujours avec beaucoup de patience. Mais enfin, bon, au bout de la 25e fois, où on lui demande comment avez-vous commencé à travailler, à dessiner les canards, etc., etc. Je me suis dit, même la personne la plus patiente du monde commencerait à craquer et qu'il valait mieux éviter. Et en fait, je me suis demandé quel était l'angle d'approche qu'on pourrait utiliser pour avoir une approche un petit peu différente. Et je me suis dit que Don Rosa m'avait dit lors de la précédente interview qu'avant d'être un dessinateur de BD, il était avant tout un fan. Mais pas seulement un fan de bande dessinée, mais aussi de cinéma et d'autres choses. C'est un grand collectionneur. Donc, j'ai cherché un petit peu dans les bandes dessinées qu'il a réalisées, des clins d'œil qu'il a réalisés à certaines de ses passions. Et je vais donc les lui montrer et lui demander de commenter sur ces choses. Hello. Donc, voilà la première image de la première histoire de Picsou publiée, réalisée donc pour Gladstone. Et dès cette première image, on voit que vous êtes un fan de Karl Barks et que vous faites référence à ces histoires passées dans cette séquence de musée.
I remember this very well. That's exactly why I used that as the very opening panel of this one story. It was the only story I thought I'd ever do. I was just going to do this story and then go back to running the family construction company. But that right there is the very first time I ever draw any of these 5 ducks. I'd done like little quick sketches for the fan magazines when I'd answer a question about Karl Barks. But and these are the first 2 or 3 years I drew. I'd copied every single duck I had. But the first thing I did when I knew I was going to be able to do this story, was I made Xeroxes of all of my favorite Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck stories, I think like 1951 through 1952, and then cut every page up into individual panels, and then sorted each one of the panels into like 15 stacks, like ducks running, ducks pointing, ducks laughing, and so anytime I knew what the duck was going to be doing, I needed him to do in the panel, I'd sort through this file of drawings. But anyway, what I was going to say is I pointedly used this scene so people would see that I was doing this strictly as a Barks fan. Mm-hmm. Everything in the picture is references to some old Barks story. Mm-hmm. So that's right. Mm-hmm. And those are pretty lousy ducks over here, but that's not a bad Scrooge. Mm-hmm. Of course, I always worked harder on Scrooge.
Mm-hmm. Et en fait, il y a aussi des gags qui sont dans l'image, qui sont aussi, je dirais, qui ont un petit côté Mad Magazine. Par exemple, ici, vous avez a rock, another rock.
Well, that's straight out of Barks.
That's out of Barks.
Yes, that came from Lost in the Andes. That exact joke. But you're still right that I grew up. What I grew up on, literally from birth, was my sister's comics and magazines, and what she had mostly were Karl Barks's Ducks and Mad Magazine and Mad comic books. So people have said, before I'd even tell them my influences, they'd say, well, I can see your interest in Karl Barks, but I also get a flavor of Will Elder here. There's so much going on in the background. And I'd say, well, that's what I grew up on, was Karl Barks and Will Elder. What do you got next?
What I'm going to do is I'm going to
And you talk about references in the backgrounds of the stories. Sometimes they're references just for my own amusement. I don't expect anybody else to catch them. I put them in there for myself.
Donc, dans la deuxième moitié de la page dont on vient de voir la première moitié, là, on devient vraiment sérieux. Hein. On a les références au le Candy Striped Ruby, Gold Bullion Flying Dutchman, Jason's Golden Fleece. Quelle a été la réaction de Gladstone quand ils ont reçu l'histoire? Ça leur a plu, toutes ces références?
You're going back 30 years now. I think they knew that's what they were going to get, and they would allow me to put my own things in the background just for my own amusement if I'd go ahead and tell a story that readers would understand, because American readers wouldn't understand any of this. This was decades after anybody had read Karl Barks comics in America. Of course, they were still being read all over Europe and the rest of the world, but so none of this stuff would make any sense except to somebody my age. And these days it would have been, 35? Now it would be 65. So, but yeah, this was even more than that top panel. This is clearly, I'm telling readers that this isn't just a duck story. This is a duck story strictly for Karl Barks fans.
Et voilà un passage que j'adore, un peu plus loin dans la même histoire. Les personnages posent des questions à un vieux monsieur qui est sur leur chemin, et le monsieur leur dit est-ce que vous cherchez encore les œufs carrés? Ce qui est là, et visiblement les enfants reconnaissent le monsieur, mais Donald, lui, n'a pas dû faire attention. Et la réaction de Donald, c'est évidemment, c'est une référence à l'histoire. What was the title of that? Quel était le titre original en anglais de
Barks's The English was Lost in the Andes. But yeah, that's again a clue for the readers who will understand that Donald is kind of frustrated. This guy is going to bring up the square eggs again, and he doesn't want to hear about that. And Scrooge doesn't know what he's talking about.
Et la raison pour laquelle
the readers don't know what he's talking about either. But I know.
Mais je pense que beaucoup de lecteurs ont su de quoi vous parliez.
In Europe, yes.
Et aussi, vous commencez à faire des allusions à l'œuvre de Barks, mais aussi, quelque part, à vous moquer un petit peu de certains éléments de l'histoire que l'on prend toujours pour acquis, comme par exemple le manuel des castors juniors, le Junior Woodchucks Handbook, où on trouve toujours les réponses, et assez tôt, vous commencez à demander, mais comment ce petit livre peut-il contenir autant d'informations?
So he says that's covered in Appendix 137Q. So the book even explains that, but I'm not going to explain it. But something Barks never did. He'd always show that the book had endless information in it. But in my stories, Donald and Scrooge are irritated by that. They're always ridiculing or making cracks about their stupid guidebook that seems to know everything.
Et en fait, vous avez continué de faire ça dans d'autres histoires, ça devient un rolling gag.
Yeah, that's what's he saying in the last. How can all that information be in that little book? Maddening, isn't it? I'm used to it. It's fun to look at a joke I wrote like 25 years ago. I'll chuckle at it myself.
Mais en fait, on finit par arriver à un moment où on ne trouve pas une information dans le manuel des castors juniors. C'est l'histoire où Picsou recherche le trésor des Templiers et on cherche une information sur les rangs, les grades plutôt des 9 premiers Templiers dans le manuel et ça n'est pas là. It's not.
Sometimes I need the information not to be there, and I try to make a joke out of that too. When the kids find out there's something missing from the guidebook, they say, "Oh, I feel faint." They can't believe it. They're so ashamed.
C'est tout leur monde qui s'effondre.
Yes.
Mais aussi c'est quelque part un commentaire sur les choses qui ne peuvent pas être dans le manuel parce que ça c'est censé être des informations complètement secrètes et qui n'ont pas pu se retrouver là-dedans.
No, that's right. That's what I meant. It's I had to have some things that, if it was in the handbook, the outcome of the story would be too easy. They know the answer, so there have to be some facts not in the handbook, just for my own convenience.
Alors, l'image suivante, enfin plutôt la page suivante, c'est la première page du 12e chapitre de la jeunesse de Picsou, Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck. Et là, on touche une autre de vos passions, le cinéma, puisque c'est évidemment une allusion à... Les fans le savent.
Citizen Kane, yeah. Citizen Kane, okay. Well, yeah, that's, I was a huge... ever since my earliest memory. I loved comic books and old movies on television. This was especially difficult, I think, at the time because this was before CDs and freeze frame. But I think I had this on videotape. So I had to keep watching that videotape over and over and over. And every time it would go past it, put another line, a little pencil mark. And I think if you compared the Xanadu and the second panel there, that's actually I've elaborated. I've added some towers to it. It wasn't quite big enough for Scrooge, but yeah, that's one of my favorite panels. And it worked out so well that there's a snowy cabin in his globe, just like in the actual movie. The most interesting thing on this page, though, is that insane first panel. That I don't know if it's big enough that you can see, maybe not. But every single this I knew was the last splash panel in the 12th chapter of The Life of Scrooge, and I knew it was, every other panel was showing things that were important to it, like his family, photos of his families and adventures, and the other 11 chapters would open that way. So for the last chapter, it opens just with money. That's the only thing that's important to him now. But the thing is, I took this so seriously, and this seems so important to me, that every single one of those coins is separately drawn with an engineering template. Not just one, but like a dozen different ones. There's different sizes and different angles of the ellipse. This is called obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Well, I have a question for you. Why would you, usually it's the other way around. You do a comic and it becomes a movie. You're one of the only author would take a movie and then transform it into a comic book. Could you elaborate?
Maybe. I'm not sure what you're getting at, but I'm getting the wrong But when I look back at the comic books I did when I was a child, some people know that I used to fill these business ledgers with big blank pages with my father would bring home from the company, and I would fill these with my comic books that I'd write and draw, but just for myself. Nobody'd ever see them but me. And when I look back at them now, the one thing I noticed when I'm writing articles about my work for things I never really sat and thought about, that I realized that these big pages of these big blank like sketchbooks, they weren't broken up into panels. Each page was a full scene. And I remember I thought of this as a movie screen or a television screen. And I very vividly remember now that I thought what I was doing was somewhere in between a comic book and a movie. Those were my two favorite things. Now, as a little kid, I didn't analyze it. I didn't try to figure out why I was doing it that way. But when I look back now, I thought I was doing a comic book movie or a movie comic book.
In fact, when you look at the shape of the when you look at the shape of the panels here,
Yeah.
they're exactly the shape of a movie screen.
Well, no, they're looking at a TV. They're looking at a 1948 television.
Oh.
So that's why every panel is the same size, and it's in black and white, you notice. But that's the reason, and the corners of these particular panels are rounded, except the caption box, which of course is not part of the TV screen, so it's square. So that's incorrect.
Alors, il n'y a pas que Citizen Kane qui a été utilisé comme référence de film. Cette scène qui est la fin du chapitre 8, je crois, fait référence à un autre film. Et vous allez, à moins qu'il y ait des gens qui sachent à quel film qui vont pouvoir nous dire. Non? Alors, quand même. Non.
This is a classic movie, 1947, with Gene Tierney and Rex Harrison, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir,
Hein?
where at the end, Gene Tierney rises up out of her body, and she's died of old age, and she was in love with Captain Gregg when he was a ghost, but 40, 50 years earlier, and she rises up young again, like happens here, and they walk into the distance, wherever they go, to heaven or eternity. And all through this, when I was drawing this, I could hear the Bernard Herrmann soundtrack of the movie playing in my head, because I live my life more through movies than comics. I interpret everything that happens to me, a scene from some old movie I've seen.
Est-ce que ça vous a aidé justement d'utiliser des références au film pour finalement parler d'une chose dont on ne parle jamais dans les bandes dessinées Disney, c'est la mort?
Oh yes, I definitely wanted to that was the classiest image of a death I'd ever seen in a movie, and that had involved the afterlife, because I had to have his father and mother reunited, and probably from the first chapter I knew that this scene was going to be somewhere in the story an imitation of The Ghost and Mrs. Muir.
Alors, ici, on va faire... Ah, là, c'est une référence à un film français. Alors, voilà, Le salaire de la peur. Quel était le titre en anglais?
Oh yes, The Wages of Fear, yeah.
The Wages of Fear, donc la même chose, Le salaire de la peur. Encore un de vos films préférés? Ou...
Ooh, it's a movie I like. I've got an awful lot more favorite movies.
Oh yeah, oui.
My favorite movies would have to be in English.
Yeah.
I can't help that, but I definitely have a CD of this in my collection. And I remember I had to be sure that they had all the colors right, and of course it was a black and white movie though. I'm trying to remember, but I knew that in the front there were obviously red and white, like Danger. So I had to tell them to make sure to color that. It's rare that they pay any attention to what I tell them. So maybe the first time this was published, it didn't have that, but it has the SOC symbol on the door, the logo of the forget what that was, Southern Oil Company, South American Oil Company. Takes place in French Guiana or somewhere in South America.
Et maintenant, une autre référence à un film célèbre. Non, non, c'est un peu tôt, ça. C'est King Kong.
This is just something this is one of the ones just for my own amusement. I'm doing a story about, it's a sequel to Karl Barks's Forbidden Valley, where they're in a lost prehistoric world. Somewhere in this story, I had to put a reference to King Kong, which is one of my 5 favorite movies of all time. And so I hope people could recognize the tree across the ravine. That's the most famous scene in the movie outside of the Empire State Building scene. And I was pretty sure nobody would catch this joke. But like I say, I do so many things in the stories just to please myself. So I knew I had to have this scene here somewhere. So I think Scrooge wants to go across the log, but the nephews have seen the movie and they know that's not a good idea. Well, Scrooge, I think the next panel is don't explain it to him. I think the last movie he saw was at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, so he won't catch that.
Mais d'un autre côté, par contre, les enfants, Rififi et Loulou, Huey, Dewey et Louie, sont eux. Ils sont cinéphiles.
They know everything. Yeah. Because I identify with them. I don't identify with. I partly identify with Scrooge. That's why I turn him into less of a greedy character and more like a collector, like I am. He collects things. He doesn't have it for greed, but he just likes to have collections. And but yeah, the nephews are the ones I identify the most with. So.
Alors, l'image suivante, c'est une image qui est tirée des histoires spéciales de la jeunesse de Picsou, donc celles qui ne sont pas dans le corps des 12 chapitres principaux, mais qui ont été faites en plus. Et c'était une histoire très particulière, parce qu'on y rencontre non pas 1, non pas 2, non pas 3, mais 4 personnages historiques qui sont passés un peu dans la légende de l'Ouest, et ça fait allusion à une autre de vos passions, le western, aussi bien au cinéma qu'en bande dessinée, en roman peut-être aussi. Est-ce que vous, je sais que vous collectionnez les comic books de western. Vous aimez les films de western, est-ce que vous lisez aussi des romans de western par des auteurs comme Louis L'Amour, par exemple?
Well, I don't read as many western. Louis L'Amour, Lou Cameron I like. He was actually he was a writer of western novels in the 60s and 70s, and he was also an excellent comic book artist back in the 40s and 50s. And I have a full set of Zane Grey novels, but actually, I don't know if I've ever mentioned being a particular favorite of Western literature. I like military fictional history like the Napoleonic Wars and so on. But I certainly like Western movies and comic books. I've got practically a full set of American Western comics back to the late 40s when they first had them. But yeah, these are... the interesting thing about this scene was this is when I started to get too caught up in history. I wanted to have Geronimo... Buffalo Bill, P.T. Barnum, and Annie Oakley in a story with Scrooge in 1890, and I had to do research to make sure they all could be in Arizona in 1890. And it's possible they could, because Buffalo Bill was not in Europe on a tour, and Geronimo was on a reservation. Maybe he escaped on a weekend or something. And P.T. Barnum, I think, was actually touring the West. So that's just when I started to get carried away with being too strict with myself about things being exactly authentic. I liked it. I enjoyed doing it that way.
Il y a une note un peu triste, un peu nostalgique dans cette scène, parce que les personnages disent que la première période de l'histoire américaine, la first era of American history, c'est terminé. Et has ended. et qui sont officiellement des reliques d'un âge révolu. Officially relics of a bygone age.
That's right. That's exactly what this panel is. It's mirrored in a number of old Western movies, maybe like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was the same idea. This is the end of the Wild West, and these people are out of date, but that's so being set in 1890, that's like the end of the Wild West era, which was actually very brief. It was like about 1870 to 1885 or 1890, about 15, 20 years. Every Western movie you've ever seen, all happens in that brief period of time. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's interesting you should mention that. That's a scene that meant a lot to me. So this is when Scrooge's day is coming and their day is gone. Mm. And that guy right there is the... I was going to do a story where Scrooge's uncle creates the first comic book, and because he was a pulp fiction writer, and then I think in this story I was going to say that he invented comic books in about 1880.
Alors, un autre personnage qu'on retrouve plusieurs fois dans la jeunesse de Picsou, c'est un jeune rancher qui, quelques années plus tard, devient quelqu'un de assez important aux États-Unis, c'est Theodore Roosevelt, qui est un de vos héros.
He is, and incredibly a Republican, but back when Republicans were honest and not insane. This is, well, the first thing I think about when I see this is the coloring's all wrong. That's not the proper coloring of a Rough Rider outfit, but I used to love the idea that because Teddy Roosevelt, or TR, he didn't like to be called Teddy, is one of the greatest American presidents, and he started up the national park system, and he did so much for conservation and so on. So different from modern Republicans. But I towards the end, if I'd gone on doing Scrooge comics, I would have been happy just to do two types of Scrooge comics. They'd be both set in the past, because I love to do stories set in history, and so I can do my historical research. I would do stories of Teddy Roosevelt and Scrooge McDuck as after he's been president, and they're troubleshooting globetrotters and traveling around the world solving crimes or something. And or I do Scrooge and Goldie and the Klondike. Those are the two types of stories I love the most. I just wish they colored the Rough Riders costumes. I gave them such strict instructions.
Oui, mais j'ai pris une édition, une des premières éditions, une des plus anciennes, parce que c'était plus facile.
It's correct in the Glenade, the new Glenade.
Yeah,
Everything's correct.
Là, j'ai pris mes propres comic books avec la première édition américaine, parce que c'est plus facile à mettre à plat sur le scanner. C'est pour ça que donc c'est pas la bonne mise en couleur. Alors ici, nous avons une image qui vient qui montre une autre allusion. Là, c'est une allusion au grand roman finlandais, le Kalevala, parce que vous êtes très populaire en Finlande.
But now, do you have an image of the original painting?
No,
because that's what this panel.
Yeah. C'est pour ça que j'ai choisi cette image, parce qu'elle fait allusion à un tableau très célèbre, mais j'ai pas eu le temps de récupérer le tableau d'origine. Mais la composition est vraiment celle du tableau. Comment s'appelle le
finlandais un peu rouillé.
Alexei, I don't know. I should have if you'd I'd have checked up on that if I knew you were going to ask that question, but I can't think. Any Finns in the audience? No.
Comment? Oui.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Merci.
Mm-hmm. Donc, le Kalevala. Et vous avez mentionné d'ailleurs qu'il y avait des problèmes de couleur. J'ai traduit cette histoire en français. Et dans cette histoire, Donald est appelé The Blue Duck, le canard bleu. Et quand l'histoire est parue, j'ai constaté que, pour une raison que je ne m'explique toujours pas et que je n'ai pas envie de connaître, Donald était habillé en rouge. Alors, je suppose que... Et pourtant, j'avais traduit les instructions de couleur que donne Don Rosa dans les marges. Donc, je suppose que peut-être, ce jour-là, le coloriste ou la coloriste qui travaillait pour l'imprimeur en Italie avait, je ne sais pas, beaucoup travaillé, n'avait pas dû faire trop attention à ce qu'il y avait écrit dans les marges. Bon.
Let's just not discuss the past printings of that. They would not pass on the coloring instructions. That's the problem. They just wouldn't care.
Mais
en fait, forget that. Now you've got the Glenade editions. You don't have to worry about that.
Dans cette histoire, il y a aussi une rencontre historique. C'est la rencontre d'Elias Don Rosa, qui a écrit le Kalevala, et qui est le premier grand écrivain national finlandais. Là encore, c'est votre passion pour l'histoire, pour les mythes, pour plein de choses.
No, not exactly.
Non.
This was a story done pretty much strictly for the Finns, because they're such big fans. I'd been traveling there already for about 5 years, and I mean, I think I know why Donald Duck is so popular around Europe in general. He's just became a national hero after World War II. It was the first, Karl Barks Donald Duck comics were the first inexpensive mass entertainment, and everybody loved it, and they were still, they had an American quality to it, so, but in Finland, it's so much more popular. I'm not sure why that is. But anyway, I traveled to Finland enough times, and finally a friend of mine said, you know, if you wrote a story that combined the two greatest factors, elements in Finnish history or Finnish culture, which is the Kalevala and Donald Duck, you'd be elected president. And so that's what my plan on was here. I wanted to be elected president of Finland, because they actually would tell me that every year or every election day, Donald Duck would get hundreds of thousands of votes for president. So I thought maybe but that's the first year they didn't really announce the write-in candidate, so I'm not sure how well I did. But it didn't work. And,
I have a question about that. Is there a lot of stories that you did that were influenced by your fans?
This one was, like I say, done strictly for the, it was done for the Finnish fans, but there was lots of other Europeans who liked this sort of mythology, seemed to appreciate it. I'm not sure if this is what you mean, but there were a number of stories, and some of my best stories that were suggested by just a sentence. Somebody said, you know, combining this and this would be a good idea, and it's, wow, that'd be a great idea. And if that's what you mean, but
yeah, definitely.
But generally, most of the time, I was doing them just to please myself. So, and just hope that somebody else would like it. When I always tell people when I look back, that of course there's no royalties in this kind of work. It's when it's Disney Comics, I get in these days not a penny out of the popularity or the sales of the work, and I actually thought maybe that was liberating, because otherwise I'd get greedy and wonder what could I put in this story to make it sell better. Would a story about soccer, you know, European football, or maybe I'll have the Huey, Dewey, and Louie with cell phones and hoverboards or something, and but since it didn't matter how popular the story was, I wouldn't make an extra penny. So I figured, well, I'll just do a story I'd like to read. So that's why I set them back in the 50s, and I just wanted to do a story like I would remember maybe reading, sitting on the living room couch in 1957, and if nobody else liked it, didn't make any difference. I'm glad a few people seem to like them.
Alors, l'image suivante, ça va faire allusion à un autre de vos intérêts que vous avez, je trouve, pas tellement utilisé dans les bandes dessinées. C'est la télévision. Parce que ces deux personnages, sont des allusions à Gilligan et The Skipper dans Gilligan's Island, n'est-ce pas? C'était subconscient, oui.
Yeah. The skipper was a nice guy. It was Alan Hale Jr., the son of one of the nicest guys in movie history, in Hollywood history, Alan Hale Sr.
Parce que, en fait, avant d'être de dessiner régulièrement des histoires de canards, vous avez... moi, j'ai rencontré Don Rosa dans les pages d'un fanzine qui s'appelait RBCC, Rocket Blast Comic Collector, et il y avait un Don Rosa's Information Center. Et c'était dans les années 70, bien avant Internet, et on posait des questions à Don Rosa qui répondait et qui vous disait, on lui demandait par exemple quels comic books ont eu des histoires sur le thème de, je sais pas, des opérations de chirurgie esthétique ou quelque chose comme ça, et il vous déroulait toute une liste d'histoires ou ceci ou cela. Mais on pouvait aussi lui poser des questions sur le cinéma et la télévision.
Well, yeah, let me interrupt. That was what I took over was an information center about comic books and a comic fanzine. And of course, but there was, in comic fanzines, there's always been something about movies and television, because it's everybody who likes comic books likes storytelling, visual storytelling. So when I took over this column that had already been around for like 10 years in this comic fanzine, I knew the first thing I was going to do was expand it to cover all of my interests, just so I'd be entertained. Movies, television, maybe old pulp magazines and old radio. And when I look back, it only had a circulation of like 2,000 copies. But I was the only public source of information. If you wanted to know every movie that some actor made, or if you wanted to know all the list of all the episodes of a TV series like Star Trek or something, with the cast members and the director and the writer, and that used to be in old TV Guide magazines. They don't put that information in now, but in the old days it was TV Guide magazines were very complete. And I had lots of reference books that I'd been collecting, not books that you could buy at any store. They're usually limited editions that are sold to libraries and usually only in California. Anyway, I was as far as I know, the only public source of information for that there was. And now, of course, there's the internet, and you can get any question answered that you want about anything in the world, probably accurately, which is much better than just 2,000 people having access to this one poor guy in Kentucky who was working all night long looking through old magazines. But I was proud of that. I love those days.
Et en fait, la dernière image, enfin la dernière série d'images vient de l'histoire où Picsou et les enfants cherchent la bibliothèque d'Alexandrie, the Lost Library of Alexandria. Et pendant toute l'histoire, Donald regarde la télé. Et alors, est-ce que vous pourriez nous dire, déjà, cette histoire, elle avait été faite, là encore, il y avait une demande de l'éditeur norvégien, je crois.
That's right. In Norway, when would this have been? 1993.
Yeah.
It was. I actually did this story in the middle of doing The Life of Scrooge. I had to. So it must have been about 1993. In Norway, they had a national celebration called the Year of the Book. So again, in countries like Norway, the weekly Donald Duck comic is extremely important culture. Everybody reads the Donald Duck comic. So they wanted me to do a story all about the history of books. I'm not even sure if they said the history of books. They just something about books. And of course, then that means I'm going to do the history of books. So I came up with the idea to do a story that involved, during the course of the story, it would tell the whole history of the written word, from papyrus to scrolls to manuscripts, and then they'd be searching for the lost library. I guess it would be the one oddity about this story, and some people didn't like it, but it was done on purpose, that Donald is filling a particular role. He's not really with the rest of them. He's separate in this story, and he's depicting the average, to me, the average American who just gets everything he knows off television. So all through the story, it's Donald just sitting watching television, and the rest of the four ducks are having adventures all over the world. And Donald's happy he's watching his favorite TV show.
Et en fait, dans l'histoire, vous êtes particulièrement mordant vis-à-vis de la télévision, parce que chaque fois que Donald regarde une série télé, c'est à chaque fois un genre différent, mais il se passe toujours exactement la même chose. Le héros s'appelle Something Savage, Mike Savage, Buck Savage, etc. Il y a une poursuite ou quelque chose à high speed, à grande vitesse, et son véhicule flips, se retourne et se met, voilà, explose.
So I'm mostly making fun of American action movies where cars always mysteriously flip. I never figured out how the car flips, much less explodes. But now you wouldn't think I was a TV fan. I'm one of the country's biggest TV fans. I even back in the 70s, I would contribute articles to books by people like Leonard Maltin. I would, and I also, and I think I may still have, as far as I know, the world's largest private collection of TV theme songs. Starting in the, I guess, about 1972, with a little cassette recorder, I would put a microphone in front of the TV and start to record the opening themes and sometimes the closing themes of all the TV shows, not just the ones I liked, but every TV show on television. And I got additional recordings from other TV fans around America. And finally, not too many years ago, I found out there was some people have put some on YouTube or on the internet. So I got the few that I needed off there. And so right now I've got a collection of it runs 16 hours of just steady television theme songs. But here I'm making fun of television, and yes, I'm one of the world's biggest fans of television up to about 1978. That's when I stopped watching television.
Mais alors, ça, vous avez fait allusion à un autre aspect de votre vie, c'est que vous êtes collectionneur.
Yes, but where's that alluding to it?
Well, ça c'est pas directement dans cette histoire-là, mais c'est simplement dans l'une des introductions que j'ai traduites récemment pour les volumes Glénat, vous parlez de vos collections, et non seulement du fait que vous collectionnez, mais que vous avez commencé très jeune à collectionner, et qu'il vous fallait toujours la collection complète.
Yeah. In America nowadays, there's plenty of comic book collectors, but they're only interested in collecting mint condition copies. They're investing. They're not the least bit interested in complete collections. They think the challenge is to increase your value and investment potential. To me, when I started collecting comic books in the early 60s, they had no value, but it was a challenge to find something that was so ephemeral that was people would buy it and throw it away, to hunt them down, find nice condition copies. They're sometimes not so nice, but the trick was to have a full set, every single issue. So that's, but you're talking about as a collector, I've got that collection, one of America's biggest collections of old comic books, and people say, oh, he's got all the Disney comic books. No, I've got all the comic books. I've got virtually every American comic book from the period when I think they were started to get good, which is after World War II, all the way up to, it used to be about 1985, and I really realized the American comics from about 1970 on were pretty bad, so I sold those off, but I'm still, just 2 weeks ago, I bought another big bunch of old comic books off eBay. I'm still collecting comic books. I'm still trying to get a full set. But also I'm a book collector, old editions. Yesterday at an interview, I was telling somebody about all the first American editions I have of lots of famous French authors. I've got a first edition of some of Jules Verne's books. I've got first editions, English editions of who wrote the Phantomas books. Marcel Alain, or Alain Marcel.
Souvestre et Alain.
That's the other. Sylvestre was his partner.
And Alain.
Yeah, and Gaston Leroux. I've got a really nice first edition of The Phantom of the Opera in English. But I've got lots of other collections of books, all the way from the 1890s to the 1980s. Usually the newer books are the historical fiction. There have been a lot of those written. But now these are not valuable. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can get like that first edition of The Phantom of the Opera cost me $60 on eBay, because there's no interest in old books anymore. People are just getting on their Kindles now. You can get glorious first editions of classic books off eBay for $5 or $10 when a new paperback costs $8. So that's a hobby. Movie soundtracks is a hobby. There's so many hobbies.
Mais en fait, il y avait un autre aspect des livres dont je voulais parler aussi, c'est que quand vous avez fait des recherches de documentation pour les histoires des Ducks, vous les avez faites à la bibliothèque, dans les livres. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous expliquer un peu comment vous procédiez
Well, when I first started doing the Duck comics was, of course, before the internet, and I'd go to the local University of Louisville library sometimes, and they'd let me into the rare book archives because I knew the people who ran the rare book archives. We once, in Louisville, the rare book archives have the world's biggest public collection of pulp magazines, including a full set of Edgar Rice Burroughs publications, and the guy who donated that to the library was then hired to be the curator of the archives. But anyway, I do that. Now, towards the end, certainly I use the internet. That's useful, but I would use the internet to get ideas, which I would then research into books that would be a little bit more dependable. But I like the internet. I'm not as tough on the Wikipedia as some people are. You just have to know it's risky. So I'm not sure what you're asking. I do a lot. I think the more interesting stories, if you're asking about the research, the one I like to tell is sometimes, like the story of The Life of Scrooge I did about in Australia, and I wanted to do it based on Australian Aborigine mythology. So I tracked down some American experts in Aborigine history, and I actually called them this is before email. I had to call them on the phone, and I'm talking about going over. And so this mythological creature represented this and this. And at some point, I asked him, I said, now I need to know exactly what name is correct for this particular character or something like that. And the guy said, well, there's only like 5 people in the world who would know if you're right or wrong. And I'd say, yeah, well, what's your point? Because I just was doing it for my own amusement. I didn't care if anybody appreciated it, but that's and another idea, if you're asking about research, was I remember it was a story set, I think The Last Lord of El Dorado. It's set in Bolivia. And of course I did my research about Bolivia, and so I'd get the flora and the fauna and the backgrounds right. So I'm in Finland at one of these huge signings where the line is like 5 hours long, and but while I'm there, somebody comes up behind me and hands me an envelope. And I didn't even see who it was. And so later on in the hotel room, I opened up the letter, and it's a letter from a biologist, a horticulturist. And he said he'd read this story, and in the corner of one panel, he saw an orchid that only grows in Bolivia. And he couldn't believe that I had done such research to get this orchid. And now I realized, well, that's a detail I put in just for my own amusement, but it turns out for the amusement of one other person on Earth, and he saw it. That's what makes it rewarding.
Yeah. Well, we talked a lot about your inspirations for the past comics. What would have been your inspiration today? I know you still watch some TV shows from time to time when you have, a day off. What would have been the inspirations today?
No, I've never seen a TV show or a new movie that inspires me. I sometimes can sit and watch them, but I forget about them 5 minutes later. They don't mean anything to me. They're chewing gum for my eyes. That's a good question. I don't.